we're going.
Do you take a picture? Don't you take a picture first?
I can do that, or I was just going to take it at the end.
Oh, okay, okay, that's all right. I'm sorry then to mess that up.
That's okay.
Okay. My name is Joe McFadden from Waynesville here, and I'm talking with Bill Robson from Mainsville, and I'd like to interview him on his experience in the Navy. Bill, it's yours.
Well, you said you wanted to start out about boot camp.
Yes.
After taking a physical in Seattle, they sent us on a train down to San Diego, and got there in November. And first thing I had to do, I worked perhaps 2 or 3 weeks in the small stores, passing out uniforms and such to the new recruits. And then we went into actual training for boot camp. We had 2 chiefs in charge. One was the good guy and one was the bad guy, just like the cops today. And we got through that without any problem, and went home on 9 days leave, which was kind of a waste of time when you look back at it. And then they sent us up to Long Beach, and from there I was transferred on the hospital ship, the Relief, and to Pearl Harbor. I was going to the rather new ship, the USS Brooklyn, a light cruiser, was probably built in the mid-30s. And for a while aboard the, maybe a week or two, aboard the Brooklyn, I wasn't assigned a locker and a bunk, so I got to sleep in a hammock, which was an experience that everyone should try at least once. A young man sleeping next to me fell out one night, and knocked him out, I'm sure. He was a tough customer. He said one word of profanity and got back up and went back to sleep, I guess, and the next morning his side of his face was green as an apple. Then I was put in a deck division.
Let me interrupt here, Bill. This was in 1940.
By now it's, yeah, by now it's
You went in 1940 though.
Yeah.
I don't think we got that on tape.
Okay, yes, I went in November 1940.
Okay, fine.
And now it's, we're in 1941, and I was in the deck division for a couple of weeks, and this officer in the fire control division called me, and we had a talk, and it sounded like he had an interesting career to offer me, so I was accepted into the fire control division. They control the offensive weapons aboard the ship, except for the torpedoes and depth charges. We control all the guns and the communications back and forth. And I think I made one liberty or two in Pearl Harbor, and then we take off in a task force. This was a friendly visit to New Zealand and Australia. I think it was, we went under wartime conditions, lights out, zigzag course, and no smoke showing. One night I was on lookout in after part of the ship, and it was pitch black. You could barely see your hand in front of your face. And I spotted the movement out there, and it was important enough that the officer deck sent the junior officer deck back to congratulate me on what I'd seen and report. And when we went to New Zealand, we stopped at Tahiti and America Samoa. Only just a couple, maybe 50 people got to go ashore in America Samoa, and everybody got a few hours leave in Tahiti. And the interesting thing there, as we were coming into the harbor, 2 old probably World War I pusher seaplanes came flying by, slow enough that you could hit them with a potato, I do believe. I don't believe they were doing 100 miles an hour. They had 6 of them, and they were able to get 2 of them in the air. And we stayed there for a day or two. And it just kind of shocked me. You've been listening to the radio, and you knew there was a war going on in Europe, but now you could see it. There were almost no young men in Auckland Museum. They were all in the service. And I think everybody got leave. And down there it was kind of the fall of the year. They brought us a load of apples to appreciate coming down there. We went back to Pearl Harbor. We went on a firing range. I think the first day, because it was a bit rough, we went back into port and came back another day. And it wasn't too long to where we were out, and we didn't go back. We kept going and going. People said, rumor was we were going to Long Beach or someplace on the west coast. Well, we ended up going through the canal. We stopped at Guantanamo Bay for a beer. And then we went up the East Coast. I can't tell you where we stopped, but we did stop in Boston. And I got to help tie up the HMS Rodney, which had had a little discussion with Bismarck. And it was interesting. There were a few not too large of holes in the superstructure of the Rodney. We stayed there maybe 3 or 4 days, and then we went to Iceland. We escorted the soldiers up there so that the British soldiers could go to Europe. On the way up, we spotted a lifeboat out at sea, and the captain ordered a motorboat to go over and investigate. And there were some bodies in the lifeboat, and Chief Boatswain, who was in our boat, took an axe and sank this lifeboat. I don't know why they didn't bring him aboard, but they didn't. And I learned something up there of how they navigate in a heavy fog. The ship ahead of us was towing a small raft that was kicking up a wake, but we could see that, but you couldn't see the ship that was towing it. So when you zigzagged, everybody had to do the right thing. And then we came back and we stopped in New York and went on down the coast, and we ended up in Bermuda, sailing around and operating out of Bermuda. I think there was a destroyer or 2 with us. And Sunday morning I had the messenger watch as I stood in deck when we were in port. And nothing happened. Later in the afternoon, the officer of deck sent me up to the radio shack to check on a message. And I was brazen enough that I read it on the way down, and Pearl Harbor's been attacked. And so I gave it to the officer of deck, and he still didn't believe it. So he went out. And then on the way back, he stopped in and informed the captain what was going on. We started to load up with fuel and provisions. That we probably should have done when we first came into port. So we spent the afternoon taking on fuel and provisions. And we stayed in harbor that night. And sometime during the night, the clipper ship came in from Lisbon, I guess. And he almost got shot down. But the chief didn't have that much courage, and then they turned on the lights and he saw what it was. But the next day I heard the captain telling him, shoot and come ask permission later if somebody is making a bombing run on us. So we took off that day. We were joined by a converted carrier and 2 destroyers. And we're sailing around, who knows, that part of the ocean anyway. And the captain began playing a little game of tag with what he thought was a submarine out there. We had 4 airplanes aboard our ship, and he would send them up and then send 2 up and then put 2 more on the catapults to make the submarine believe they were all there perhaps. And one of the pilots got a probable on a submarine, and then we went down to Trinidad and back to New York, and had a few days leave. I went home to the West Coast, saw my parents. My mother was getting sick by this time. She ended up having Parkinson's disease. It took them a long time to diagnose it, which is typical even today, I think. So it took I was sent up to Boston for a new ship, the Fitch. And on the Fitch, one of the interesting things was one of the division officers, a young man who graduated in 3.5 years instead of the usual 4. He had ridden up from Washington to someplace in New York with Mrs. Roosevelt in a club car, and he was just amazed that she was a very, very nice woman who knew how to entertain. I think, like so many young men, had told that the other party is full of evil people and no goods, but he was really blessed with meeting Mrs. Roosevelt. We went up to Portland for our shakedown cruise, and on the way back, one of the after gun mounts was failing to work, and the fire controlman was blaming the gunnery people, and they blamed us, and we finally found the trouble was in the hydraulics. When they had put them together, took the cap off of the 2 connecting pipes, there was a cork in one of them, and they left that cork in there, and it caused a lot of confusion. And on the Fitch, we had a 1.1 machine gun, 4 barrels, that the Navy had made or constructed, and it was more dangerous to us than it was to the enemy. Other than that, it was a good ship, and we had a lot of submarine alerts, and I was on the ship until 43. We probably sunk maybe 10 ton of cod out there. I don't think we ever got a submarine, but we sure dropped a lot of trash on them. We took 3 plane loads on the old Ranger, probably P-40 pursuits, off the Gold Coast of Africa to the Free French, is my understanding. We were in Trinidad when the Juno, the new light cruiser that was sunk in the Pacific, and lost all the men from Iowa, 4 brothers, I think, or 5. And we went to deliver the planes to Africa, and they went to the South Pacific. On one of the trips over, there was somebody found that we were losing fresh water, and the captain lost his cool. Said we found the person that did it. He'd leave his submachine gun on the after deck, and we could take care of him. I don't suppose he would have done that, but he was mad at the time. And then eventually, we were on the Fitch. We were in Bermuda, maneuvering with several carriers. Most of them were converted, and it seemed to me like they lost 2 or 3 people overboard. Couldn't imagine how they could fall off, but they did. But we never did turn up a body. We went and looked several times, but the bodies were gone. So we started east, and we knew it was east because every morning at general quarters we'd be facing the sun, and in the evening it would be to our backs. And this morning at general quarters, I was sitting on top of the director just looking around. I looked over my shoulder. And up came a few masts and then more. And it was the biggest group of ships I'd ever seen. And that was the day that Casablanca was taken. We stayed out with the carriers. And I did see a periscope, about the only enemy that I'd ever seen. And I don't think anyone was lost that day. And then the next day, a couple days later, we went up the coast of Africa, fueled up, and went back to the States. And I think about that time I got a few weeks of a school in Norfolk. And I think this school was just a vacation for the sailors who served in the North Atlantic, like the Murmask run. That was pretty tough run, I think, and I think they were just giving the school was just a rest bracelet instead of a school. I was senior PO of my group for the class there, and talking to the other rated personnel. They thought I ought to talk to the executive officer. And so I went to talk to him, and I said, your instructor, there's something wrong. He's very confusing, and he changes what he's saying, even the same day. And he said, don't worry about it. Everything will be taken care of. Just be good people. And so we really weren't learning anything, and I was wondering, how are you going to go up in a rate if you don't learn anything at school? I'd come from the farm, and all I knew about electronics was the what you have on any automobile, Model T or Model A Ford, and that's that don't get you very far, and I knew that. So near the end of the course, we had this course basically in physics, and we covered just too much territory to know anything. So at the end, getting near the end of that week, the instructor said, I know you all cheat, you all have crib sheets. Is it all right if I give you 10% more than what your average grade is? So we all said yes. And I'm still wondering how we're going to pass the final test. Well, in the morning of the final test, miraculously, the answers appeared to us. Where they came from, I don't know. But I was given a copy of the answers. So everybody passed. Went to Boston, and my ship was in the North Atlantic. I think it was Task Force 22. Part of the time we had the Alabama, which had been in the engagement in the South Pacific. Tankers, probably heavy cruisers, and British carrier, and a couple British destroyers, and we were operating between Iceland and Scapa Flow. The day of the invasion, I think, of Sicily, we went pretty close to Norway. We observed for quite a while, and then as the seaplane was going back up, we set up some fighter planes and knocked it down. And we went up and circled Bear Island, which is in the north of the Arctic Circle. And we found floating mines up there. We detonated a few of them. We got to eat British food. Their meat was terrible. Their bread was wonderful. Their jams were out of this world. And when we were in Scapa Flow, we would trade oranges for milk with the soldiers that were stationed there, which was a good deal for us, and they loved it. Then in the fall, I'd like to turn this off and have a drink of water.
Okay.
So in the fall of the year, we went back to Boston, and the chief told me that he was transferring me. He didn't think the other first, second class could maybe do the job. Of course, I couldn't have either, but we went down to Norfolk with the nucleus of the crew. Part of it went up to Bath, Maine, where the destroyers were made. This was a Fletcher type destroyer with 5-inch guns on it. While we were in Norfolk, I had taken a group of maybe 50 men out near the landing field. The main gate wasn't too far from where we were at, to get instructions on how to abandon ship in a swimming pool. We had just left the swimming pool and probably 50, 60 yards from the main gate of the airport when wham! The concussion almost knocked us down. I don't know what happened. One of the mines went off and or whatever. And I got the men started again, and then it wasn't 5 minutes this truck went by and there were bodies laying there that the t-shirts were just red with blood. And the Enquirer, I found out much later, when I met a man at the Y who was there that day at the airport, that there were like 6 men killed. But he said it was more like 26 or 36. He said we lost a lot of men that day. Well, we stayed there doing drills like that and fire drills. They'd have a tank setting out with water in it, a horse tank, maybe 10 feet across and 30 inches deep. And they'd pour a gallon of fuel in there and they'd start on fire. And you'd have to come up in the smoke and put it out. And then they'd put you in a compartment and do the same thing. And it was, and then you'd have floods and you'd have to patch the side of the ship with whatever was there. And it was an interesting drill that everybody should maybe go through. And then we went up, I took 5 men, we went to Portland and for radar instructions, a little more. And we come back to Boston when the ship was constructed. And this was a tough time. We only had 2 officers who were Navy men. The rest of them were all reserves. The captain and the executive officers were Navy men. I think maybe the gunnery officer was also. So we went on shakedown cruise and out around Bermuda, and then we went out to meet the president coming back from Africa, I think, through a bad storm through Cape Hatteras. And Hatteras, as you know, is never gentle. We didn't have any clothes for cold weather. And some of the men in the 40s about froze to death, I think. So we went on and we stopped at on south. We went through the canal, out the Pacific. This was I never thought it was a good ship.
What was the name of the ship?
This was the Wadley.
Wadley.
Yes.
This was a Fletcher class.
Yes. I was standing watch, the main battery director, and there was only 3 of us, and there should have been 4. And it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. The watch had been set, and so I called up and had everybody check in, and the people on the searchlights didn't check in. Couldn't raise them, so I had the man in the back of the director open and shut the shutters on the searchlights. Well, he opened them, couldn't close them, lit up the whole South Pacific. And so he had to go down 2 or 3 decks and up 2 or 3 decks, and they checked the searchlights at sunset, had to turn them off. So it kind of charred the controls, and that's why we couldn't shut it, because we got them turned off. And I knew I was going to face a captain in the morning, but nobody ever said a word to me. All morning, I knew after the 8 o'clock report that I'd be called up to see him, and I didn't know what I was going to tell him. So then we get to Pearl Harbor, and we take a LST of Marines down someplace on a small deserted island. There were a couple Japs on it. A little practice for the Marines, I thought. And while we were out there, the captain decided there should be a security watch. So he issued a 45 to 4 chiefs, and they stood the security watch. And one of the chiefs was the pharmacist. And I don't think, according to Geneva Conventions, that pharmacists carry weapons. The chief argued a bit, but didn't get any place. But as soon as we got back to Pearl Harbor, the chief asked, and the doctor asked for both, and they came back not too long with an admiral in the medical corps. And the captain was irritated because he couldn't use the chief, so he said, well, then there won't be any security watch. And we hauled mail, and we hauled Marines, and such things as that. And eventually, we would ferry pilots away from the fleet to pick up a plane to fly back. We did some of that. And in the Saipan, we came in, and I don't know if we did any of the first bombardment, but we worked with the Marines. We would anchor offshore, maybe 500 yards, and give support to the Marines to break small pillboxes and such. And they told us later, when we met them in Frisco, that we did a wonderful job for them. We found out then that we knew that the Japanese had better flashless powder and better smokeless powder than we had. They fired directly at us in one shot that we couldn't see where it came from. And it was there that we went around the island. We had somebody aboard that could speak Japanese or whatever. They were jumping off the cliffs, the people were. And we were telling them that we wouldn't hurt them, that they surrendered. And we come around this cove, and a sight that I will never forget. There must have been up to 500 Marines that had been floating in the water for 2 or 3 days. Their bodies were all swollen like they were trying to get out of their uniform. And it was a terrible sight. So we went out on picket duty one night, and at midnight I was relieved, and walking down the deck, and I heard the guns train up, and we didn't fire at this ship, and so I assumed it was friendly, but I did hear a large splash, huge splash, off our fantail. The next day I learned that this was not necessarily a friendly plane. We had identification, friend or foe, and they didn't show any identification. So it's my opinion that we should have fired at them when they made the bombing run Alice. So we're sailing around. We never know where we're at. The one nice thing, I went to Turkey a few years back, and I met the pilot who first flew off of Saipan, B, whatever it was, to attack Japan. And he said that the island was none too high for his load. He said he almost hit the water. It was only 300 feet above the water. And when we were with the fleet a couple times, in the South Pacific, powered by steam, those carriers could not hardly get up enough speed in the hot weather, could make enough steam to get up full speed so the airplanes could get off. And if those tails touched the water, they went down. And sometimes coming in, we had to pick up what was left of the pilots. And then eventually we ended up down in Peleliu, which was the nation before the Philippines, I believe. And we were, they gave us a task. There was a mine sweeper there, sweeping the mines, and we tried to set them off with rifles, but with 40s worked the best. And we must have, in the morning, we got caught a couple times in the minefield. And I don't know how we got out of it. I really don't. You could just look over the side of the ship and see them there. And we must have detonated maybe 40 mines. And then after lunch, I was just goofing off, sitting back up on the director. And there was commotion down on the bridge, and they're picking up speed, and they sending a guy out to the forecastle. And all of a sudden, he's yelling and screaming that we had been ordered, I think, to top speed, and we didn't get very far, maybe two, 3 minutes before this happened, and blew a big hole in the side of our ship. But we didn't sink. We had 3 compartments flooded, but we didn't sink. It's my opinion. So I don't know, but probably the captain was delivering some scotch to the admiral. That'd be my humble opinion. They tried to build a big box and sink it, put life jackets on the edge of it, draw it up with cable, but this didn't work. But in the meantime, this storm came up, and it was pretty awesome. You saw the airplanes take off, the PBYs, and all the ships took off except the Prometheus, which we were tied to. And there's a reef not too far from my stern that the wind is blowing us into. And it was snapping big 1.5, 2-inch hawsers like you'd snap a string. We did have a steel inch cable between us and Prometheus, and that held. So it was a bad night. The fleet lost 3 destroyers that night. We ran out of fuel, and were lost at sea. And then they sent down a floating dry dock to fix us up. While we're in the dry dock, all this time we're listening to Tokyo Rose. She was the one that had the good music out there, if you remember. And she threatened us all the time. And so eventually they did send a couple of planes our way, but the Air Force and the Army knocked them down, but 2 of them got through. And they were about, maybe 6,000 yards from us, and they were coming right in, and then they switched over to sea-going tugs instead of, I don't know what they want them instead of us. The bombs missed them, and then 2 P-38s, the twin fuselage planes, came and knocked them down. And eventually we went back to Mare Island, and they fixed us all up as good as new. And we went back out to sea. I did get 30 days leave while we were in Mare Island to go home to see my folks. My mother was in the hospital at this time. And as soon as we left port, I asked the new division officer if I could be transferred to school, since I was the only one board ship in my division that hadn't been to school. So he said he didn't see why not. So in a couple months, it was possible that I could be transferred back to Washington, D.C. to a pretty good school, electronics. And I stayed there for about 6 months, and when I got there, the war was over. Then I went up onto the Quincy mast to get aboard the Philippine Sea, which was a big carrier. And that's what I was discharged off of at Providence, Rhode Island, Quonset Point. And that's where I got to see Mr. Truman. His yacht came up there and parked on the other side of the pier. I saw him walking on the water. He's a big hat, it had to be hairy. and that's my military career.
When were you discharged?
Sometime in November. They let me out early, but I had leave coming, so I'm not just sure what the date was. That was 46.
46, okay.
I did 4 years.
Very good. And what have you done since you were discharged, yes?
Well, I went home right away and helped my father and brother build a milking barn. My mother I never knew my mother to be well, and she had a lot of trouble with pollen, corn pollen in Nebraska, and things didn't go too well there, so they moved to Washington, and my brother and I helped my parents out a lot to get settled there. And I wanted to buy a farm myself there, in the farm, but they discovered red raspberries and good farm ground in 1946, and in the county there was running $1,000 an acre.
Oh.
And I just didn't think the government would support these farmers all their lives. So I went to school to learn a little more electronics, and when Mr. Taft was putting a station on the air, television station, he was one of the few people that had a license.
In Cincinnati?
Yeah. So I wrote to him and he said, come and let's talk. And so I spent 25, 30 years at Taft Broadcasting.
Very good. Are you married?
My wife passed away in '87.
Oh, I'm sorry. How about children?
I have a boy who's the librarian at Rose Holman, and a daughter who's a nurse at Bethesda North, and the daughter's working as a chemical engineer in Cincinnati.
Very good. Is there anything else you'd like to speak of?
Well, I can tell anybody who wants to listen, war isn't going to settle anything.
That's right.
And those 500 bodies.
You'll never forget.
No.
I'm sure
And I can imagine what it was like in Europe and on these islands.
Where were these bodies you were talking about? What island was this?
I was at Saipan.
Saipan.
It's either Saipan or Tini, but I think it was Saipan.
Okay.
They'd sent us around, they'd give us a bullhorn, and that day we picked up a North Korean 2 or 3 miles out. We've been trying to get away, I guess. It was interesting. We had everything pointing at this one naked body. 20 millimeters and 40s.
Yeah. Well, if you have nothing else, it's been a pleasure, and I thank you very much for your information.
Well, thank you.
Glad to meet you, Bill.
I just wish that they had started this 10, 15 years ago so we could have some World War I veterans.
Yes.
My uncle was in World War I, and he learned to hate the military with a real passion. He was an OD, osteopath. He's one day out at sea when the armistice was signed, and they kept him in Europe for 2 years, and the best he could get was a first sergeant. Nurses with less training could get a lieutenancy.
Yeah.
So when it came time for his bonus, he told him to keep it.
Very good. All right, thank you very much, Bill.
Oh, most welcome.